He's won 20 Grammys. He spent more than 3 decades teaching millions of people about grace, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek. So what happens when the man who built his entire career on that message gets pushed to the very edge of his own patience? On a public sidewalk in front of hundreds of cameras. That's exactly what happened to gospel legend Kirk Franklin in Philadelphia this summer, and the video of it has not stopped spreading since. Today we're breaking down exactly what happened, why one street preacher's words cut so deep, and what this whole moment reveals about fame, faith, and family in the age of viral video. Let's set the scene first, because context is everything here. It was late June, specifically June 28, 2026, and Philadelphia was in the middle of the Wawa Welcome America Festival, the largest Independence Day celebration in the entire country, running from June 19th through the 4th of July. Kirk Franklin was booked as the headliner for a major event called Gospel on Independence, set at Independence National Historical Park, with reports of a choir of more than 250 voices ready to perform. This was supposed to be a celebration, a night of music, faith, and community on one of the most historic pieces of ground in America. Instead, the sky had other plans. Around 8:30 that night, severe weather rolled in. Lightning and rain forced organizers to postpone the show. And eventually the concert was called off entirely. Franklin never got to deliver his headline set. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because instead of just leaving, the 56-year-old artist stayed in the area to greet the fans who had waited, some of them for hours, to see him. There are clips of him climbing onto the roof of an SUV just to wave and connect with the crowd that never got their concert. It's a small detail, but it matters, because it shows a man trying to give people something after a disappointing night. And that's the exact moment when everything changed. A man approached Franklin in the crowd. He's since been identified online as a street preacher who goes by the name Judge James Thomas and who brands himself on social media as the Sin Police. Thomas began demanding that Franklin repent, accusing him of misleading his audience for years. Franklin, by all accounts and by the video itself, tried to keep things calm. He can be heard telling the man, "That's not what I said," and multiple witnesses say he even offered the man a hug, an attempt to diffuse the tension with kindness instead of conflict. The preacher refused the hug and kept pressing. Then came the line that changed everything. Thomas told Franklin, and this is the exact phrase that lit the fuse, "You and your wife are going to go to hell." And in an instant, the calm, composed gospel star that millions of people know from the stage completely disappeared. Franklin's whole demeanor shifted. He moved toward the man aggressively, and it took several members of his security team, along with Philadelphia police officers, to physically hold him back before things could turn physical. No punches were thrown, nobody was arrested. The preacher was eventually escorted away and complied without further incident. But the 43-second clip of that moment, security scrambling, police stepping in, Franklin straining against the people holding him back, spread across social media within hours. So why did this one line hit so much harder than the accusations about Franklin himself? Because it wasn't really about him anymore. It was about his wife, Tammy Franklin, a woman he's been married to for roughly 3 decades. And if there's one thing we consistently see, whether it's in politics, sports, or entertainment, it's that people will tolerate criticism of themselves far longer than they'll tolerate an attack on their family. The moment Thomas brought Tammy into it was the moment Kirk Franklin stopped being the calm public figure and started being, simply, a husband defending his wife. Now, this wasn't some random insult pulled out of thin air. The preacher's anger traces back to something specific. A freestyle Franklin performed at the 2022 Bet Hip Hop Awards, where he used the phrase describing the lion and the lamb bowing down to what he called the goat, a reference clearly meant as hyperbole about greatness in the music industry. But some conservative Christian critics interpreted that line as blasphemous, arguing it elevated a person above Christ himself. Franklin has previously clarified that it was artistic language, not theology, but for critics like Thomas, that explanation was never enough. In this case, Thomas didn't just criticize Franklin's supposed theology. He tied his wife directly into what he called shared spiritual accountability, referencing the biblical story of Ananias and Sapphira, a married couple in the Book of Acts. That's the justification he gave publicly after the fact, defending his decision to mention Tammy by name. And speaking of Tammy, her response afterward tells you almost everything you need to know about how this couple handles pressure after decades in the public eye. Rather than getting defensive or issuing some formal statement through a publicist, she went straight to social media and handled it with humor, jokingly referring to her husband defending her honor. It was warm, it was lighthearted, and it was very clearly a couple who have weathered enough public storms together that they no longer feel the need to explain themselves to strangers on the internet. Franklin himself didn't release any lengthy statement either. The next day, he simply posted about the weather forcing the cancellation, joking that even the weather needed to repent. No apology, no lengthy explanation, just Kirk Franklin moving forward. But here's what makes this story bigger than just one viral clip. This is not the first time Kirk Franklin has been confronted like this in public. Back in 2019, in Jacksonville, Florida, a different street preacher accused him of having, in his words, blood on his hands. And Franklin handled that encounter with calm conversation rather than confrontation. So the pattern is clear. As one of gospel music's most visible and most successful crossover artists, someone who has spent his career blending traditional gospel with hip-hop, R&B, and pop influences, Franklin has also become a lightning rod for a certain strain of religious criticism that argues he's diluted or compromised the message of the church for commercial success. And it's worth zooming out even further, because the Philadelphia moment didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened after years of Franklin being remarkably open about his own struggles behind the scenes. He's spoken candidly in interviews about how, earlier in his career, he prioritized his music and his touring schedule over his marriage and his family, creating real strain at home during those years. And then there was 2021. Arguably one of the most difficult chapters of his public life, when his estranged eldest son, Carrion, leaked an explicit and emotional phone call in which Kirk can be heard threatening him during an argument. That recording went everywhere. It forced both Kirk and Tammy to sit down together publicly, including an appearance on the Tamron Hall show, where they addressed the language used in that call while also opening up about more than 2 decades of family therapy and behavioral struggles they had been managing privately the entire time. Franklin has even described that period as one of the most traumatic stretches of his life. So when you put all of that together, the touring years that strained the marriage, the leaked call with his son, the years of public scrutiny over his theology, and now a stranger screaming at him and his wife on a public sidewalk, you start to understand why this particular moment hit different. This wasn't just a random heckler story. It was the collision point of everything Kirk Franklin has spent years trying to process publicly and privately at the exact same time. And that's probably why the internet's reaction wasn't the pile-on you might expect. Instead, The overwhelming public response leaned sympathetic toward Franklin. Comment sections lit up with people saying they would have reacted the same way, or worse, if a stranger had condemned their spouse to hell in front of a crowd. Even people who disagreed with how far he stepped toward the preacher largely agreed that bringing his wife into it crossed a line that almost anyone would have reacted to. There's also a broader conversation happening here about how believers are supposed to disagree with each other. Plenty of commentators pointed to biblical passages, ones that talk about speaking truth in love and restoring people gently rather than tearing them down publicly. Essentially, asking whether confronting someone aggressively on a sidewalk in front of cameras was ever really about correction at all, or whether it was about the confrontation itself going viral. At the end of the day, what makes this story so compelling isn't really the theology debate, and it isn't really about who was right or wrong in a sidewalk shouting match. It's about watching a man who has spent 30-plus years telling other people how to handle their lowest moments get caught, unscripted, in one of his own. Kirk Franklin didn't stop being human just because he built a career preaching grace. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. The loudest test of anyone's faith isn't how they perform it on a stage in front of thousands of fans. It's how they react in the 90 seconds nobody expected to be filmed. Franklin's music has spent decades pointing people toward mercy and redemption. This moment was simply a reminder that the person delivering that message is still, at the end of the day, just a man defending the people he loves. If this breakdown gave you the full picture, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories actually shaping culture. Drop your take in the comments, and share this with someone who needs the context behind the clip everyone's talking about.